My name is Duff Gibson. I'm a captain with the Calgary Fire Department. And just under 15 years ago, my wife and I adopted our two sons from Ethiopia. So we are a mixed race or a two-race family. And hockey for both of our sons has always been a wonderful part of their upbringing, really. Our eldest son has graduated high school now, so he doesn't play organized hockey anymore. But our youngest does, and he's a Calgary Royal. And this presentation is a version of a talk that I gave to the parents of his team last year in response to an incident that happened at an out-of-town game in which our son was serving a penalty for someone else, actually. And when the penalty was over and he was leaving the box, the parent volunteer from the other team called him a black mother effer. And this was overheard by a teammate who told the coach. And in our view, it was handled very well from that point forward by the league and by the Royals organization, and most significantly, in our view, by Coach Brad and some of the parents who had made the trip to this game. And we hadn't. So we felt in hindsight that our son was well taken care of by the people who were there with him. But one of those parents confided in me that what he found to be the most distressing aspect of that incident wasn't what was said, it was our son's reaction to it, in that he didn't seem upset, he wasn't angry, and he really didn't want to make a big deal of it. And that was our experience at home as well. It took a lot of prodding to get him to sit down and talk about it. And it took until the second time we got him to sit down before he even was willing to admit that that's actually what was said. And his comment was, it's not a big deal. It probably happens every second game. And so, as you can appreciate, this is a very personal thing for us. It's something that I think is very important and maybe underappreciated a little bit. And I'm recording this here today in the hopes that maybe we could spread this message beyond just the parents of one hockey team or organization. And if people would consider passing it along, that'd be wonderful. And it's a message really about the prevalence of racism in our society. And if you don't think it's one of the world's big problems, or at least not where we live, it's more about something that happens in another place, then I present this with no judgment whatsoever. Because if you had asked me, say 15 years ago, if it was a major problem in our world, I would have said, well, you're always going to have an individual here and there, or perhaps a small pocket of people, but society-wide, it's not a major issue. And I had an experience 3 or 4 years ago now that was very enlightening. And it was through the Calgary Fire Department, and they put on a 2-day mini conference kind of a thing, mostly for chiefs and administration, but I was part of a committee, so I was invited as well. And as a part of that conference, we did an exercise called the race. And some of you might be familiar with this, as a version of it went around social media a couple of years ago. And the idea is that a running race is a metaphor for life, and we all have our own race to run, but some of us get to begin with our starting blocks, move forward slightly, and some of us start with the blocks back a little bit. So the format of this exercise is we all begin shoulder to shoulder, as if we were on the starting line of a race, and a facilitator reads a series of statements relating to advantages and disadvantages you may have in life, and if they apply to you, you either take a step forward or back. So for example, a statement relating to an advantage would be if one or both of your parents went to university, take a step forward. A statement relating to a disadvantage might be if you started your education in a language that wasn't your first language, take a step back. So that gives you an idea of the kinds of questions or statements involved. And I should say this, I knew how I was going to do in this before we even started. Both my parents were teachers. Both of my parents were teachers at my high school at one point, so there was never any doubt that I was going to do my homework and that my sisters and I would go on to a post-secondary education, which of course we did. And that's exactly what happened. I took steps forward in this exercise until I was against a wall. And then I just, listened and observed everybody else, which is the point of the exercise. And the last two statements are etched in my mind at this point. The second last statement was, if you have been called a name that refers to your race in the last month, take a step back. And I was participating that day with two friends of mine who are both Black, and in each case, I had known them since before any of us were firefighters. In one case, I had known the guy for 25 years. And in the other case, I had known the guy for 30 years at that time. And they were both standing beside each other over my left shoulder. And when that statement was read, I looked over and they both took a step back. And that was very surprising to me. And if you'd asked me to guess when the last time one of them or each of them had been called a name that referred to the race, I would have guessed high school or, something a decade or 2 decades ago. And it was, as I said, it was phrased in the last month, and they both took a step back. And while I was wrapping my head around that one, the last statement was read, and keeping in mind we're all firefighters, it was, in the course of your duties, if someone has ever refused treatment from you because of the color of your skin, take a step back. And when I just heard that, my heart sank at just the thought that could actually be someone's experience. And I thought, don't tell me. I looked back and one of my friends took a step back to that question. And I had a very strong reaction to that, a very emotional reaction to that, because these, in part because these were two guys that I have known for decades. And my reaction was very strong for a number of reasons, one of which I'll talk about in a moment. But one of the reasons was the format of this exercise, in that there was no context involved. And I think that if we hear something that we're not comfortable with, or something that doesn't fit with our view of the world, sometimes we write it off. We know a little bit about the context. For example, if someone called you a name that referred to your race, well, who called you that? Oh, that guy's an idiot. Don't even let it bother you. We might even instruct someone as to how they should feel about their experience. And you couldn't do that in this case. It was just, in essence, did that or did that not happen? And they both took a step back. So it was very powerful in that regard. But it caused me to reach out to my one friend who took a step back at the last question. And I asked him about that incident. And apparently it was an actual white supremacist who had been in a fight. And I know there's some young people listening to this, and this is a very harsh thing to say, but he had been in a fight and was actually stabbed in the stomach and was bleeding on his couch. And my friend and a colleague walked in the front door, and this guy said to the colleague, "Get the N-word out of my house." And that in and of itself is a very startling thing to hear about. Intellectually, I know that person exists in the world, but the thought that, someone in my city doing the same job that I have done for decades would have that actual experience and come face to face with that was very shocking. And it's just, I have a very strong reaction to it, and I get choked up thinking about it, and I'm only hearing a story. It's not me actually experiencing it firsthand. And so my next question for my friend, of course, was, is that something that happens regularly? Is that something that has happened before? And his answer was that, calling getting called the N-word by a white supremacist is not an everyday occurrence. And most of them weren't examples of overt racism, but he was able to, because I asked, he was able to recount example after example after example after example, and he'd think of one and it would remind him of two others, and it just went on and on of how racism had impacted his life on a semi-regular basis. And so, with his permission, I will share a few of those examples now. And as I say, having a white supremacist call you the N-word is not something that happens every day. And a lot of what he shared was what you could call mistakes. So for example, he and his wife live in a very nice part of the city, or maybe just outside of the city to the west. And on one occasion, he was mowing his lawn and someone was driving by and stopped and got out of their car and waved him down and asked him how much he charges. And similarly, in his community, he was doing some drywalling in his basement and throwing some scraps in a dumpster in his community. And someone was driving by who may have been the president of their community association or something along those lines. And she pulled over and got out of the car and started yelling at him that the dumpster was only for people who lived in the community and it wasn't for tradespeople and so on. And he very calmly explained to her that he had lived in the community for a number of years at that point and that he was just doing a little work in his own basement and he wasn't a tradesperson, and she wouldn't have it. And she kept yelling at him. And I know that what he finds the most upsetting aspect of that is that the whole time she's yelling at him, he's very conscious not to raise his voice because he doesn't want to perpetuate the stereotype of the angry black man. And so, you might say, well, those aren't cases of overt racism. Those are mistakes. And they are, on some level, those are mistakes. But the point is that I have no, parallel experience. I've been mowing my own lawn for 35 years or whatever it is at this point, and no one has ever confused me with the gardener. And I can say that it has never once crossed my mind in my lifetime that I better be careful of what I say or how I present myself because it might reflect poorly on other white people. And yet, that's something that he is burdened with. But nonetheless, you could say that those were honest mistakes and not cases of overt racism. And okay, so here's another example. Before my friend and his wife lived where they do now, they had a place just north of downtown. And there was a series of car robberies in their neighborhood. And at one point they heard something out front and they looked through the curtains and someone was trying to break into his wife's car. And so it's November, there's snow on the ground, and my friend runs outside in bare feet, shorts, and his basketball singlet from high school. And I mention that just to say there were clues that he wasn't running around the neighborhood breaking into cars. And he grabs the guy, and they can hear a siren, so they know the police are about to arrive on scene. And he doesn't hurt this person. He doesn't throw him to the ground. He just holds him against a tree until the police arrive. And when the police arrive, they tackle my friend and put him in handcuffs. And when I hear that, I think to myself, how many times would that need to happen to me before it drastically changed my view of the world and how the world does not treat everybody the same? And it might be one time. And here's another example. And this is something that requires some thought and consideration to try to put yourself in his shoes and imagine what you might think or do in this situation. But here's the scenario. You're driving in the city with your wife, and you're pulled over by police, and you weren't speeding, and you don't have broken tail light, or you didn't stop at a stop sign. There was nothing like this. And when this is all said and done, no ticket was issued, so no one is disagreeing that there was no traffic violation of any kind. But you're pulled over by police, and you roll down the window, and the police officer comes up and looks past you and asks your wife if she's okay. Implying that she might be in some kind of danger. And that's happened to him 4 times. And I have the advantage of thinking, how would I react to that? And a few scenarios go through my mind, but I probably would react the same way he did, which is say nothing and wait till it's over, sort of thing. And I know there's at least one police officer watching this, and I want to make very clear that I am not implying that there's a policing problem. I think that there's a people problem, and police officers are people, just like firefighters are people. And those were the only 2 examples of all of them that involved police, and there were much worse examples. And there are a few that I am intentionally not sharing because they are just so far over the line that you might not believe it, or you would write it off by saying, well, that's not a society problem, that's an individual. And on some level, that's true. But if this one friend had as many stories, we talked a long time, and the conversation didn't end because he was out of examples. And this, not that this should make a difference, but this guy is cool and funny, and my kids idolize him, and I idolize him. And he worked for our family business, which is a kids multi-sport program, and he he remains the most beloved coach that we've ever had, to the extent that when he wasn't there, kids would complain. And yet none of that makes him immune to this. And I mentioned before that there was one reason why I think it hit me so hard doing that exercise so many, 3 or 4 years ago now. And it's this. If you asked me how well I know this guy, I would have said, I know him very well. And what hit me so hard was there was obviously an aspect of his life that I didn't know at all. And when I asked him how that could be, how could he have so many examples of racism in his life and me be completely unaware of it since we've been friends for so long, his answer was, in essence, that he has learned in his life that anytime he talks about race or brings up racism specifically, he's playing the race card. And so he doesn't. And just handles it himself. And that's not something that I would wish on a good friend of mine or a stranger. It's certainly not what I would want for my kids or anybody else for that matter. Because I really, I've had a number, this friend of mine, we're on a committee together, so I see him very regularly. And there's always a new story, and there's always another example if you can get him to talk about it. And I think it's not something that you grow out of. It's something that accumulates, and it's something that he carries. And that's why I worry about our sons. And so what do you do about it? Well, here are just two absolutely simple suggestions. And the first is, if you know someone who's Black or Indigenous or who is just different than how most people in society are in some manner, don't assume what their experience is. Ask them what their experience is. Don't assume that it's a version of your experience. It's a conversation that is very startling, unsettling, to say the least, upsetting, but absolutely enlightening and valuable. And it requires trust, perhaps on their part more than your part, but it's something that I think is absolutely valuable and would very highly recommend. That's one. And number two, and again, this is super simple. If you hear something or see something, please say something. Because our son won't. For sure, our son won't. And my friend has learned that when he does, it's an exercise in banging his head against the wall. So it's kind of up to the rest of us. And to tie it back to hockey, if someone makes a comment about race to our son, that could go in one of two completely different directions, right? If no one steps forward and says, hey, that's not cool, then my son doesn't make a big deal of it, as he says, and handles it himself. But if someone steps forward, maybe a few teammates step forward, and a referee and a coach and parents and maybe even the teammate of whoever made the comment in the first place says something, then that's a completely different experience. And the comment was still made, and maybe that still hurts, but it's a chance at least for our son to appreciate how almost everybody feels about racism and its place in our world. So if you see something or hear something, please say something. And I hope that's something you'll consider. Thank you.